All right, good morning or good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for signing up and logging on to our webinar. We're about to get started. So this is the Carnegie Community Engagement webinar, Finalizing Your Application. We're going to introduce our speakers and then move on to the rest of the webinar. John?
Thanks, Marisol, and thanks for putting this together. I think this will be a really good resource for folks. So I'm John Saltmarsh. I have a visiting scholarship at the Swear Center at Brown University, which is where the Carnegie classification is housed. And I direct the classification. I also teach at the University of Massachusetts in Boston in the higher education program. So I'm really looking forward to this, and hopefully we can address as many questions as we possibly can in this time. Thanks.
Absolutely. And I'm Marisol Morales. I serve as the Vice President for Network Leadership with Campus Compact, and I also serve on the National Advisory Committee for the Carnegie Classification for Community Engagement. We're excited to be able to pull this together as an additional resource for our member institutions who are in the process of working on their Carnegie applications or reclassifications. So the purpose of this webinar is for campuses that are in the process of putting together their application for either first-time or reclassification applicants for the Carnegie Community Engagement classification. The focus of this webinar will be a discussion of strategies for coherently conveying evidence in a way that makes your best case for institutionalization of community engagement. Advice and insights will be provided for campus-based experiences with putting together an application, and ample time will be provided for any questions participants have as they finalize their application. Anyone interested in the classification is welcome to attend, but this webinar is not oriented to a more foundational overview of the classification. So this is for you folks who are sort of in the thick of it right now, and hopefully this will help provide some guidance and answer some questions as you are moving through it. So just a quick overview in terms of the classification timeline. The framework was released in January 2018. The portal was open in May of 2018, and the application deadline, which is, I know what you all are paying attention to right now, is April 15th, 2019. Campuses will be notified in December, and then there will be a public announcement in January of 2020, and that's when you can show off your bright, shiny classification buttons. So I'm going to launch a poll right now to see who we have on. So if you can take some time to answer. Go ahead and let us know if you're a first-time applicant or reclassification or an early reclassification. Spend a little bit more time so we can make sure that everybody is able to answer. Okay. And if you can make sure to answer in the poll if possible. All right, so we're going to unpoll right now, and we're going to share the results. So as you can see, about 62% of those of you on this webinar are first-time applicants, and then we have about 38% reclassification. So this is great. That'll help direct our conversation today. So I also want to mention, we have a question and answer feature on here. And so we're going to encourage participants that if you have specific questions in mind, if you can use that question and answer feature instead of the chat. John and I will be working on answering those questions live, but it'll also give us an opportunity to kind of see if we need to do any follow-up. But you have opportunities to start typing in your questions now, and then we'll have an opportunity towards the end or the middle of the webinar to just open it up to answering questions that come up in our question and answer section. Great, so I'm going to start off with reflections on the application process, do's and don'ts. Prior to joining Campus Compact, it's been about a year, I was the founding director of the Office of Civic and Community Engagement at the University of La Verne in Southern California. And at the time, the university was about 2 years into a new president who was very committed to community engagement and to the university pursuing the Carnegie application. They had started to make some moves towards just building off of a long history of community engagement at the institution, but it wasn't sort of institutionalized in terms of a center or really dedicated funding. So I was brought on, and I was brought on in, let's say, August, and the application was due in April. And so in a short amount of time, not only sort of moving from Chicago to California, having to get to know the institution and the community, but also having to engage in the process of applying for the Carnegie classification. And really, I would say that for me, although it was scary and overwhelming, and there were times where I felt like, oh, I don't know if we're gonna get it, or should we be doing this? The ability to pull a team together from across the institution who had both institutional memory but also understood kind of the best practices in community engagement was really helpful. And also having the support coming from the president's office made gathering the information that we needed in order to submit towards the classification really possible. And so I think that there's a few things to keep in mind as you move through the process. One, it's really a self-study. And so you don't have to be doing everything at 100%. I think being able to indicate, where you're at, where you're striving to be, what is in the process, as well as showing evidence of what you've been able to accomplish. So whether it's changing some language in tenure and promotion documents to reflect, a support of community engaged or public scholarship, or the support of funding, authentic community partnerships, the ways in which investments are taking place, and what you're in the process of doing. But for us as an institution, and for me as someone who was new to the institution, really focused on being able to achieve the classification, it was really an amazing experience of gathering that information and really demonstrating to the institution what we were doing, what we were already doing, and what we were striving to do. So just some things to keep in mind in terms of effective approaches. Really focus on the definition that the classification provides for community engagement, right? So look at it and understand how that fits in with your institution. For us at La Verne, we adopted that definition as our sort of central definition in the way that we talked about the work at the institution. Thinking about the institutional perspective. So really being able to build a cross-institutional team. So for the team that I was able to put together, we had folks from our teaching and learning. We had folks who were doing programs, first-year programs. We had a associate provost. We had our chaplain, folks that had been at the institution for a number of years. We had an assistant dean, and we also brought in a number of other folks to review, to provide additional data, but we also went around talking to different units across the institution to let them know the importance of this endeavor and the ways that they could help in pulling in the information that we needed. We also were able to kind of set some time to go and pull everything together, so sort of a retreat setting in order to have that concentrated time to not be sort of pulled off task. The other thing to remember is that this is for the campus as a whole, not part of the campus. So it's not just for student affairs or for academic affairs, but how community engagement is being embedded across the institution. If your campus has done a civic action plan, I think you can really leverage the information that you gathered from that to also include in the Carnegie classification. You want to think about the ways in which your institution is making investments maybe in athletic fields with the local city or in other kinds of partnerships where resources of the institution are being directed towards the local community. The other piece is don't leave blanks. If you don't have evidence, talk about what you're seeking to do. Make sure that you answer everything and be honest, right? There were areas that we had not either thought of or were in the development of, and we were very honest about where we were in the process. And I think that helped show because we had evidence of sort of other achievements that we'd made towards this, that we weren't just filling in the blanks to fill in the blanks, but we were really working towards a plan of deeper institutionalization of community engagement. So, these are some effective approaches to keep in mind as you're pulling together your application and moving forward.
So while you're on that point, Marisol, one of the questions that Brad asked was about pitfalls, particularly first-time applicants, but I think it's true for all. And I do want to sort of just reiterate what you said about don't leave blanks. So when you work through the application, there are yes, no answers, and whether you hit yes or no, a drop down box will come up where you can put in text. So if the answer really is no, that's okay, but then talk about why it's no, why it is you don't have that evidence. Are you planning to gather whatever that evidence is? And what's you're thinking about, like the importance of that at your campus, and is that part of your strategic thinking? What you don't want to do is leave things blank in either the yes or the no box, because what that leaves the reviewers with is trying to figure out what goes there, and the reviewers just can't sort of fill in the blanks for you. So in terms of pitfalls, that's certainly where applications run into problems.
Absolutely. All right.
So another way to think about this too, if it's helpful, is the application is designed in a way that there are multiple dimensions to community engagement, and the key is that you need to address all of them, right? And one way to just think about this diagram, if you only have pieces of it, say you only have the partnership dimension and you don't have the other pieces, it's going to be really hard to get classified. So just think about sort of the multiple dimensions that go into community engagement, and that you want to have evidence for all of them. And then I just want to share this too, which is more looking at this from the reviewer's perspective, which I think is also helpful as you're putting together your application. And this will also address a question that was in the Q&A, which is about how things get weighted. So I'll talk about that too. So first of all, it's a holistic review. So what I mean by that is that there's no one area that is weighted more heavily than others, although I would say foundational indicators is really critical. It's foundational, that's why it's called foundational. And also just keep in mind that if you don't have evidence in one area, it's not going to sync your application. And there's no one set of questions which is going to make or break an application. It's a holistic review. Foundational indicators, as I just said, are really key. And so reviewers look at those carefully, and you want to make sure that for a successful application that you've got evidence in those foundational pieces. Also keep in mind, from a reviewer's perspective, there should be a coherent institutional narrative. And what that may mean is that even though you have a team, like Marisol explained at Laverne, where she had a team that worked on this, when you file the final application, you might want to have maybe one or two people do that sort of final writing, so that there's sort of a clear narrative that runs through, and a narrative voice as well. What doesn't work well when you're doing a review is where it's really clear that somebody wrote one part and somebody else wrote another part, and that'll get to the next point I'm also going to talk about. So just think about how you're going to do this in a way that you've got sort of this clear sense of what the narrative is. Another key piece that reviewers look at when reviewing an application is what I think about as alignment. So across the application, are the answers aligned? And just the example I gave here, but we could look at other examples too. So if the application says, oh yeah, it's absolutely in our mission, and we have a really strong mission statement around engagement or civic purpose related to engagement. But then you get to the question around strategic plan, and there's nothing in there about this being a strategic priority for the institution. From the reviewer's point of view, there becomes this question of misalignment. And then the reviewer begins to look for these points of alignment throughout the application. So you should keep that in mind too when you're putting together an application. Is there alignment across? And then the last thing I'll just say in terms of what reviewers are looking for is whether or not the community engagement work has been implemented. And so this goes back to Brad's question too about pitfalls. Pitfall is when we get an application and the entire sort of narrative around it is we plan to, we're intending to, we hope to, but there's not evidence that it's actually been implemented yet. So just keep in mind that you get classified for community engagement that's been implemented, not for what you're aspiring to. That doesn't mean that there may be certain parts of the application where you actually haven't done it yet, but you actually have a clear timeline and plan to do it. You do want to provide that information. But if the entire application is about just what you're planning to do in the future, it's not gonna work, right? You're not gonna get classified.
Yeah, I think that's a really important piece. I know for myself, when I came to Laverne, some of that work had already been done prior to me arriving. And so it was easier for me to show evidence of, some language in our strategic plan or some movement on promotion and tenure, it being part of our mission statement, as well as, the fact that we were building an office and working towards institutionalization. Because again, the office was about 6 months old by the time we submitted. But there had already been movement. So figure out the places where at your institution that movement has already taken place. Again, if you have done a civic action plan, you might also want to be able to use that as evidence.
Okay, and so we just wanted to give you a couple slides in terms of resources too. There is a book that came out last year, which is a really good resource in terms of putting together your application. So if you don't have that, you might want to get a hold of it. There's a really good chapter in there by Marisol from her work at Laverne, where she goes in more depth about the kinds of things that she was just talking about, particularly in terms of putting together a team. And then there are also resources at the Swear Center Carnegie website, and we continue to add to those resources. So that's a good place to go. We'll also link the recording of this website, of this webinar, to that site as well. So you can find it both at the Compact and at the Swear Center site.
Absolutely.
And then you can always contact us too if you have questions. I was telling Marisol earlier, I get questions just about every day about the Carnegie. And I'll get back to you right away. So if you have any questions, you can always email me. No matter how specific or arcane they are, you can send them to me.
And I'm happy to answer questions as well, or, forward them on to John too. So at this point, we want to really just spend the rest of our time together answering questions that are in the queue and encouraging you to sort of take this opportunity to post any questions that you may have, as we're going through. So maybe, John, we can start from the top and then go through. So Candace had asked, can you provide some guidance on what it means, what is meant by program grants on the faculty incentive grid?
Yeah, so in terms of faculty incentives, are there grants that are provided for faculty to do community engagement work? And I have to probably go into it, but I think that probably means internal grants, funding provided inside the institution.
Great. And then,
yeah, so the question about local and global engagement, keep in mind, and this is actually a really important point, that everything is contextual to your institution. It's not to some external standard around this. And so you have at the beginning a section to contextualize both your institution and the communities that you work in. And so if you do a lot of work internationally as well as locally, you need to provide that context, and that's really important for the reviewers. And I would also just say on that point, and this is true with a number of others too, if you feel like the questions that are asked don't provide the opportunity for you to provide evidence in an area that's important to the context of your campus and the communities you work with, you have a section at the very end which is kind of open-ended. And there's actually two opportunities for that. And you should use that to add any additional information that's really critical to understanding your application.
Right. And then we have, we would like to use data from last academic year, but also data that is for the current year.
Mm-hmm. That's fine. So it asks you to use 2017-18 data, and the thinking there is that's available, should be available to you as you put it together. If you want to use more current data, that's fine. Just indicate what year the data comes from. So if you say, we're wanting to use our data from 18-19, here's the data, here's where it comes, here's the year that it comes from. The important part is the reviewers want to know when that data is from. Because if it's like from 13-14, that's actually not really very helpful. So yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, in the partnerships, I'm just reading through the questions. So in the partnerships section, the question's asking how many faculty, staff, students, do you just want the number alone?
Yes, right. Yep.
So this is for the quantitative data. And then when will, when will the survey be sent out to partners? A time window would be helpful. And our partners asked to know. They want to know.
Yeah, I don't know exactly the answer to that. I'm hoping early on. We get the applications in April, so I'm thinking probably in May, but we don't have a specific timeline on that.
Okay. And then what counts under faculty consultation?
So that's probably in, I'm trying to think of what area that's in. I think what it means is to do faculty do consultations outside the campus with community partners.
Okay. And then is there a rubric that reviewers will use to score? If so, could that be shared with the applicants?
Yeah, that's a really good question. The answer is no. And it's not that a rubric may not be helpful, but we've tried at least a couple of times with members of the National Advisory Committee to design a rubric for the entire application, and we actually weren't able to do it. So there is no rubric.
And do you know if campuses will receive results from the NICE surveys prior to the classification application deadline. We completed this in the spring and know that there was a delay, but are hoping to get some feedback prior to submitting the application.
Yeah, just so if, I think what you should do is if you want your results from the NICE, at whatever point you feel like you need them to add into the application, just email Brown and ask them to run your data. I'll just tell you, the longer you wait, the higher the N will be, because campuses are continuing to add to they're submitting their data, and so the N gets larger, which just makes your data more valid. But at whatever point you feel like you need it, you should just ask for a report, and then you'll know also what the N is when you get your report.
And then if an institution is successful in 2020, do we reclassify in 2025?
Now, reclassification is on a 10-year cycle. So you wouldn't, if you're successful in 2020, whether as a reclass or first time, you won't need to do a reclass until 2030.
Which is awesome. We have heard service learning infrastructure and support is heavily weighted. How accurate is that?
It's part of the foundational indicators. And again, there's no weighting on this, but as a foundational indicator, whether or not there is infrastructure that helps to support the work across the campus, in many ways is really key to institutionalization. So if there is an infrastructure, then what is there and how does it work? Let me add another piece to that. You may actually have multiple places on campus, centers or offices that do community engagement. And you want to be really clear about sort of what those different units are and what they do. And then really importantly, how do they communicate with each other? Because if this is really institutional engagement and these different units are highly fragmented and aren't interacting, it's again really hard to think about how does the institution coordinate its engagement activity. So that's why the language that's also used in there is coordinating infrastructure. And again, it looks very different on different campuses. If there's absolutely nothing and there's no staff and no budget, it's really hard to think about how this work gets institutionalized.
Absolutely. And I think that speaks to the question that we received about institution-wide efforts, policies, practices, especially if a university is decentralized. She's asking what's the best approach in that aspect. I mean, I think based on what you were saying, John, that the ways in which, even if there's decentralized units, the communication is taking place. Are there regular meetings with the folks in academic affairs who are doing this, maybe the folks in student affairs who are doing this, or maybe within the colleges? What kind of communication tools and mechanisms are there for coordinating the work?
Right.
And I think, honestly, when you're looking at sort of best practices with community partners, being able to, even if you are in a decentralized institution, it is more burdensome for the community partners to be interacting with these different units and not understanding the differences. So the more that your units can communicate, I think it's also better for community partners who are managing all of these different relationships as well.
Right, really good point.
So the question is, can you clarify definitions for part-time? Does it apply to faculty, adjuncts, and or staff? And for evaluation support?
It applies to faculty, and so it's about part-time faculty. Adjunct is actually a term which gets used differently at different institutions, and so an adjunct could be full-time or part-time. So when we say part-time, we mean part-time faculty.
Right, and if you're talking about adjuncts, then clarifying that if they're part-time or full-time adjuncts. Okay. And then Leslie's asking, Should we include information about academic community engagement, such as fieldwork, clinicals, and practicum experiences that are not part of the academic service learning program? We have a lot of programs like this that are engaged in reciprocal partnerships and meeting community identified needs, but they are separate from the service learning program, and so not captured in those numbers in terms of percent of faculty, percent of courses offered, etc.
Okay, so based on that specific question, the answer is yes, you would want to count those, because those kinds of internship or practica experiences, if they really are partnership experiences with qualities of reciprocity and mutuality, then they really are, they do fit under the community engagement definition. How you're going to count those on your application is probably going to be a little bit difficult. You might want to have to use those last sections to have that information. This is a really important question, though, and usually what happens is that the question is, how do I count these other experiential opportunities as part of the community engagement? Well, the question is, are they really community engagement, or are they experiential opportunities? And it's not that experiential learning through practicum and internships isn't important, it's really important, but what reviewers will often look for is that the campus is actually able to make distinctions between these different kinds of activities. So an application might say, for the community engaged courses, here's what we're counting, and we're not counting these other experiential opportunities that we do on the campus. So just know that the numbers that we're providing are really just for the community engaged opportunities, and we know the difference between them. That's really helpful for a reviewer to when they're going through the application. The flip side of that is it's not helpful if all of these things get clumped together and then the numbers all get lumped together, and then it's really hard to figure out what's going on.
Yeah, and I think it relates back to the following the definition of community engagement that the Carnegie classification has. So thinking about that as you're assessing whether or not those would count. So there's a question from Cynthia. In the community partners section, is there a word count like other sections? Also, is the number of staff, is it referring to staff at the sites?
So in terms of word count, wherever there is a box where you have the opportunity to put in a narrative, there is a hard count at 500. That's always the case.
Okay. Great, thanks. And then are you, for the staff, is it referring to staff at the sites? I think we maybe need a little bit more clarification of what sites you're talking about. So there's another question. In the partnerships, also, do the numbers for the entire time the partnership has been in place or just recent years?
The question has to do with how long has the partnership been in existence. That's what we're trying to get at, sort of the longevity of the partnership.
Okay. And Melanie's asking, can we insert tables into the narrative? For example, we would like to include some demographic info in question 1 that will be more readable in table form.
You can do that, and it's going to be entirely up to you in terms of the amount of space that takes up. So just like with the, excuse me, just like with the first time application, it tells you specifically not to put in links, partly because it's going to take up space, and the reviewers won't look at links for the first time. They will for the reclass, but not first time. So if you want to put in a table, if you think that's the best way to communicate the information, you can do that, but just think about how much space that's going to take up, and does it really allow you enough room? But sure, you can do that.
So Adam is asking, the community engagement definition leaves open the question of whether strong partnerships need to be nonprofit or public organizations. It seems like there is a space for for-profit orgs to be included under the partner umbrella. Can you say more about this?
Yeah, I would say, Adam, you're right on track. There's absolutely space for that. But again, then the question, do they meet sort of the qualities of relationships of partnerships? And if those are with public or private or corporate sectors, that's fine. They just need to to meet the definition.
And we have another question. We have a law school and seminary that are part of the university, but not part of the structure that supports undergraduate community engagement. To what extent are we required to include information from these graduate programs? My answer would be that, again, this is for your institution as a whole. And so being able to include that information, I think, would be important because you're looking at the whole institution if they're part of your institution. At Laverne, we had a law school. We did include those numbers as well as numbers from our graduate programs.
Yep, I agree completely.
Mm-hmm. So Mary's asking if we can repeat when the partner survey will be sent out.
Yeah, what I said is we don't have a timetable for that. I'm hoping it will be early, and I'm thinking probably in May. If your community partners are asking, just tell them that they can expect it in May.
And for students in the partnership grid, do they have to be traditional students on campus, or can they be non-traditional, non-credit students, such as common with extension programming or community-based research? Can we clarify the type of student in the narrative about impacts on the institution or community?
Yeah, you can clarify it. The questions are designed around full-time equivalents of undergraduates. And so if the populations that you work with that are involved in community engagement don't fit into that, then it's contextual to your campus and you just need to provide that context.
Candace asked, does board membership count under faculty consultation? Like maybe being on the board of directors for a local nonprofit?
I guess it could. Yeah, I suppose it could. I typically don't think about board membership as being a consultant, but I suppose in certain circumstances you could consider it that way.
Mm-hmm. And then maybe providing some clarification around that, kind of what kinds of organizations.
Yeah.
So it'd be helpful to see these answers in chat before the verbal answer. Well, I'm not sure we can do that, but we will see. There is another question. Does the institution have search recruitment policies or practices designed specifically to encourage the hiring of faculty in any employment status and staff with expertise in and commitment to community engagement?
So what's the question?
So I'm not sure. That's all it says. Can you clarify the recruitment question regarding hiring faculty with expertise in community engagement? Okay, thank you, Janine. We have an inquiry into faculty affairs, but our job calls all relate to the mission of the university, which includes CE. So FA is a bit confused about the question.
Yeah, so I think I understand it. And I would say that just referring to the mission of the institution isn't enough. If the job description, what we're asking about, does the job description specifically identify as part of the requirements of the job commitment to experience with community engagement? So with a faculty job description, it might specifically say, we're seeking candidates who have experience with community engaged teaching and learning. And it probably still will say something about, supporting the mission of the institution, but the mission can be awfully broad sometimes. So that's what that's looking for.
Then Brad is asking, in terms of opportunities for growth, what is the most common area of feedback given to classified institutions?
Well, those are those common challenge slides, and we could go into those. But maybe what we'll do is hold off and just see if we have more time to do that. You can go to the Carnegie website at the Swear Center, and there's information there about the common challenges. Go to the resources and slides that we use for workshops and pull that out, and you'll see a number of slides that address your question.
And we'll also be placing these slides on our Campus Compact website, so you can access if you want to go back to the recording of the webinar. So Joy's asking, word limit is 500 on each question. Is this true for B, co-curricular, and E1, outreach, and 2? We are way over on these sections.
Yeah, it's true for every box on both the class and reclass has a hard count at 500 words.
So maybe bring a writing and rhetoric faculty on your team so they can help edit it.
Yeah, and we know that it's frustrating, but it's a balancing between asking for evidence and having a reasonable review process. If this were open-ended, we would get hundreds of pages of documentation, which is just not reasonable to try to sort through. So that's why there's a hard count on it. And it's still, these applications are still very long in the end.
So Mandy asks, there are a number of co-curricular questions that sometimes are hard to fit into the exact Carnegie definition, such as Greek life or athletics. Advice on how to frame that.
Email me separately, because it's a nuanced question. I'm not sure I could really answer it here.
Yeah, I would say like at Laverne when we submitted, we did, because our Greek life did a lot of service. We worked with them to kind of define that, and we counted it, as well as we were Division III, and so our athletics departments were also very involved in service, so we included some of that as well. But yeah, email John directly for kind of some more discussion on that.
Yeah, if that didn't answer your question, but maybe that's what they were getting at.
In the curriculum section, should we only include courses that have community engagement service learning designation, or can courses that have these components but not officially designated acceptable to include?
So I guess I would answer that with a question, which is, when you gather data on your campus, what do you gather? And I would assume that if you have a designation, that's a way of sorting through data and gathering data. And so it seems to me that if you have a designation and a process for designating courses, that's what gets counted. And if the other courses aren't designated, then it's sort of, as a reviewer, I would wonder, so why not? And then should they be counted? So I think I'd stick with the designated ones.
Mm-hmm. And Steve Grande, hey Steve, so as you indicated that we could use data from 2018, 2019. Can we cite examples from the current academic year too?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, if you have like really recent data, sure, use it.
Okay. Megan asked, could you possibly include a summary of these questions and answers whenever you post the slides? We will attempt to do that. I think part of the challenge is just seeing if we can get that information back from Zoom. So if we can, then we can attempt to do that. The other piece is that if there are additional questions that you want to email us, we will work on answering those and posting those online as well. But you can always go back to the webinar to go and hear the answer as well. So Janine is asking, can you clarify the recruitment question regarding, I think we did that one. Sylvia asks, the hardest questions for us right now are those concerning outcomes and impacts, as in regarding students, describe one key finding from current data, indicate how you arrived at this finding. There are many sources of data, many findings. Do you have guidance on what kinds of outcomes will be most relevant, interesting to reviewers?
No, I don't. And what I do is sort of flip it back and say, make your most compelling case. So use the outcome data that you have that you think makes the best case for whatever particular outcome area it is. And in some ways that's true across the application. Put your best evidence forward. And so that's how I would think about that. There's no sort of right or wrong way of doing those questions. It's really sort of up to you to figure out, based on the data we've gathered and the analysis that we've done, how do we understand what the outcomes look like? And then what does that tell us about the quality of the work that we're doing? So the best data that you have, use that as your example.
There's a question, did I just hear that reviewers will not look at links evidence for first-time classification, but will for reclassification, and why not?
Yeah, so in the first-time classification, it specifically says do not put in links because reviewers will not look at them. And that has to do with the sort of the overall substance of these applications. The reviewers just simply can't be going into links to be searching for the evidence. So you just need to be able to provide that in the 500 words. In the reclass, it's a different situation. And so for specific questions, it will actually ask to add the link in, and the reviewers will go and look at those links, not for everything, but for certain questions. And part of that is because the reclass is really about what's happening now on the campus, what's changed since your last application, and what's the evidence for it. And so the reviewers want to, if something particular has changed, and say there's a policy change and there's a new policy, we want to link to that so we can actually see what it says.
Okay. So there's a question, what if we don't have a designated way to count community engagement courses on our campus, given the decentralized nature of who we are, mostly professional schools, schools of medicine, school of law, school of social work, dentistry, all have their own accreditation processes?
Well, accreditation processes are different than community engagement data. So if you don't have any way of knowing what it looks like across the campus, then sort of, I guess, some sort of explanation for how you think about that, or how does that data come together? It's sort of like what we were talking about. If you have multiple centers, do they coordinate with each other? So if there are multiple places where data gets gathered, is there any way that that data gets combined so you have a sense of what the institutional picture looks like? Because otherwise it's kind of hard to tell sort of what this looks like institution-wide.
Right. And then Cynthia asks, to clarify staff in the community partner section, it says number of faculty involved and number of staff involved. Is the staff referring to staff involved at the community partner organization?
No, it's referring to university staff.
Okay.
Yeah.
And on partner survey and getting larger and asking for a report, I'm confused by what is being discussed. Need clarification. I guess around the partner survey?
I think that was around the NICE question.
Okay.
Right. The National Inventory for Institutional Infrastructure for Community Engagement. What we said was if you're doing that to gather data that you want to put into your Carnegie application, you can have the report run at any time, but the longer you wait, the higher the N will be and the more valid your data will be. Right now, the N is nearing 100, which is actually going to give you pretty good data, but it'll probably be like 150 in another few weeks. So just up to you when you want to ask for that report.
Right. And can you talk a little bit about the partner survey that goes out?
Yeah, so I'll just do a little bit of background on this in terms of we've had feedback really since the beginning of the classification that there's no way for partners to have any input into the application. And it's always been a hard thing to figure out how to get that in a way that would actually be meaningful. So what we're trying in this cycle is a way of getting community partner feedback. So one of the things that gets added to the community partner data that you give us, what used to be the grid, but now isn't a grid anymore, it's actually in a narrative form, is we want you to send us the contact email for the community partner, and then we send them a survey which mirrors the questions that are asked in the application, so that we're getting independent feedback from them. And a key question that may be in our questions here, I just haven't looked at them all, but it comes up all the time, is do we share those answers with the campus? And the answer is no, we don't. And it says that in the application, because we want to offer the campuses the anonymity to get candid answers from them. And so we get the responses for them, but we don't share that back with you. If you really want that data, and I suspect many of you do, you would have to ask the community partner to share it with you.
Mm-hmm. And there's a question, is there an emphasis on partnership longevity or on quality? I ask because we made a decision to include long-term, medium length, and new to show depth and continued growth and creation of relationships with our communities.
No, there's not a preference on longevity. It's just a way to sort of understand what the sort of larger terrain of the partnerships look like. If you do have that kind of intentionality around how you think about your partners, it would be good to add that information. And if you need the space to do that, use the spaces at the end. Because there are more and more campuses that are really trying to be more intentional about their kind of the levels of partnership that they think about sort of their partners working in. So you want to be able to communicate that. It's a really good question.
Yeah. And then would you provide some additional explanation and maybe some examples of the differences between outcomes and impacts in the assessment section?
Yeah. So for most of us, when we actually gather this data and we take a look at it, what we're looking at are outcomes. We've had certain inputs that we expect will have certain results, and so we have outcomes. Outcomes aren't necessarily impacts. Impacts tend to be longer term. And so depending on how you are analyzing your data and actually how you've designed your data gathering processes, you may have outcomes, but you also may have impacts. And so it's leaving room there for you to talk about how you're making sense out of your data. But don't confuse them either, because outcomes aren't necessarily impacts.
Great. Sylvia, I know you have mentioned that you're not sure if it got addressed. Can you let me know whether or not either in the chat section, the question you had on outcomes and impacts was addressed by this last one? So we are considering doing the NICE for our planning, for our own planning purposes. Should we try and do that before completing the application, or is it better to just wait and do that later?
I think it depends on sort of where you are in your planning process. If it would be helpful to do that now and have the data for planning, and then you can also plug it into the Carnegie, that's great. But it's not, I guess another way to say that is that you can submit your Carnegie without it, and it wouldn't be detrimental to do that.
There's a question about the board membership. We have, it says we have plenty of faculty and staff who serve on boards, but we internally ruled those out as community engagement. Should we rethink that?
No, I wouldn't rethink that, because it in large part may not be community engagement.
Right.
So
we did not include that in ours in terms of faculty consultation.
Yeah.
Do you have any suggestions of how, if to include branch campuses, how do most institutions approach the inclusion or exclusion of branch campuses?
So pay attention when you first go to the Carnegie site at the Square Center. You'll see there's a box which says policy change. So prior to this round of classification, the only campuses that could apply were those that had their separate Carnegie basic classification. And if you wonder whether you have one or not, you can go into the Carnegie classification site at Indiana University and find out whether you have a basic classification. What that meant was that there may be a campus that has the classification, but there's, say, 3 or 4 branch campuses in different parts of the state. The problem with that was that those branch campuses are in very different communities, often have very different kind of context and mission, serving different populations. Some of them may be more engaged than the central campus. And so it was hard to sort of put all that together into an application and make sense out of it as an institution. So the policy change is now that if you are a branch campus, you can apply separately, and actually you have the option to apply separately or to apply as the whole institution. It's really up to you. How do you want to do it? And for many branch campuses, there's a preference for just doing it on their own, simply because they tend to be more engaged than the other campuses. So you have that option now. So just pay attention to that.
Yeah, I want to go back to the question that Sylvia had asked in terms of the hardest questions concerning outcomes and impacts, as in regarding students. Describe one key finding from current data and indicate how you arrived at that finding. There are many sources of data, many findings. Do you have guidance about what kinds of outcomes most relevant to reviewers? So specifically, if there's a lot of sources of data, what would be most relevant for the reviewers?
Yeah, I still would sort of say what I said before. Use what you think makes the best case. So if you have, for student outcomes, if you've been gathering data and you have data that demonstrates that students have higher grade point average in community engaged courses than they do in other courses, that's actually really interesting data and is a sort of a powerful piece to understand what are the outcomes from our community engagement courses and how does it impact students. So that's how I would think about something like that.
Okay, so just basically using what you think is best and where you have the most data to pull from. Okay. So we only have a few more minutes left. We're not going to be able to get to all of the questions that are on here. We'll do our best to be able to kind of transfer these over and answer them and provide some answers on our website. But I want to see if we can get a couple more before we finish. So Leslie asks, I know that the application framework suggests that if we can't answer yes to all the questions in the foundational indicator section of the application, we shouldn't continue with the application process. But based on your response to previous questions in this queue, our university will not be able to say that we have a university-wide policies related to P&T or search and recruitment specific to community engagement, because our university-wide policies are deliberately broad for both of those items. That's not something that's likely to change in the near future, but we do a lot of community engaged work that I think would make for a good application. Should we take the tip from the framework and not apply?
You need to make that decision yourselves. What I would suggest, and what it says in that box at the end of the first section on the foundational indicators, is that you need to sort of assess where you are at that point. It also makes the point that if you do submit and you aren't successful, you have the opportunity to have a consultation and get individualized feedback on your application. I'll just tell you from doing that in the past, many of the campuses take that really seriously and then come back with a successful application the next time around. So that's, I think, just something to think about as you go forward. Just sort of repeat the end of that question again.
It's particularly around the, if they don't have it in their university-wide policies.
Yeah, that goes back to what I said before, that there's no one question that's going to sink your application. And certainly we get applications where the answer is, the faculty reward structure is actually determined by a union contract, and we can't change that. So that's important information. You want to put that in there. But then also just some discussion about how incentives are created for faculty within the context that you're working with to help incentivize their work in community engagement. That would be really helpful to know.
Great. And then our last question before we finish is, what are the benefits of becoming a Carnegie school?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I think it really is up to the institution what the benefits are to that. And that's why when we do the workshops, we always talk about capitalizing on the Carnegie classification. Some campuses do that really well, and some campuses don't. And I think from my perspective, a lot of it is sort of how you go into this is going to determine how you come out of it. If you're going into it because your president has told you you must do this because you need the classification, or if, say, you're in the state of Florida where the legislature has mandated that public campuses have to have it, that probably isn't the right reason to go into it. The right reason to go into it is because it's an opportunity to do self-assessment and improve your work. And if that's how you go into it, you're going to come out of it on the other end saying, okay, we've learned a lot in this process, and so what do we do next? And you start implementing that, and you capitalize on it. And again, if you go to that book that we mentioned before as a resource, there's a really good chapter in there from Weber State in terms of what that meant for them, how they really leveraged the classification into a whole new body of work. So it's really up to the campus, what it means to them and what they plan to do with it.
Wonderful. Thank you. And again, there's resources online. We're happy to also answer some questions, but we have come to time on this webinar. Thank you all for your participation. This will be available on our website. I'm imagining it towards the beginning of next week, so you can always go back and listen through. And we hope that this was informative for you, and that this is helping you as you're moving through the process towards submitting your application.
And thank you, Marisol, for putting this together.
Absolutely. Yep. All right. Take care, all. Stay warm if you're in Chicago or anywhere else in the Midwest like I am. All right. Thank you.